Naked and Afraid, Last One Standing, Season 1, Episode 6 has got to be one of the most draining and depressing episodes of Naked and Afraid that I've ever seen. But it will be my job to sort through all the foolishness and give my opinion on the important happenings for this episode. So without any further delay, let's jump right in. Now I must admit that when I'm wrong, I am wrong. When last week's episode ended on a cliffhanger, I initially believed that the show wouldn't do the obvious and show Jeff joining Gary, Chini, and Sarah. After all, it was the obvious pairing, and Gary and Jeff had already had several conversations about the possibility of teaming up after the first 21 days. And for some reason, I thought that my expectations would have been subverted. However, I was wrong. And seeing Matt join Waz, Dan, and Steven let me know that the teams will be completely uneven. My first issue with this episode was the complete disrespect that Jeff's own team showed towards him. When Jeff first got to his camp, Sarah and Chini immediately gave him the cold shoulder, and I'll even go as far as to say that they were acting like little kids that didn't want to eat their vegetables for dinner. And there's all this tension in the camp because Jeff didn't want to simply give away items he worked hard to acquire to cast members that have done little to nothing to acquire anything during their time on the show. I gotta side with Jeff on this issue. The show was promoted as a competition, meaning that at some point, the concept of there can only be one winner will eventually kick in with these folks. Now we're well past the halfway point of the season, and the majority of these cast members have convinced themselves that they're going to kumbaya all the way to winning $100,000, and that's simply not the case. But I was extremely disappointed in Chini for this episode. She likely would have never made it to the 21-day mark without a significant amount of help from the other cast members. And even after making it that far, she was too slow to realize that she's receiving so much help to make it because the other survivalists do not see her as a threat. And if they can convince her to work against Jeff, that's one threat that's been eliminated. At one point in the episode, Chini had the nerve to tell Jeff that there won't be any bartering in their camp. Newsflash, Chini, during your entire time on the challenge, you've never had anything worth bartering with any other cast members. Dan essentially did most of the work while teamed with you, and you flew under the radar. The straw that broke the camel's back for me was how Chini was feeding the other team information about Jeff and how she went to help them look for survival items. Chini would seemingly be okay with letting her team fall apart if it meant getting Jeff out of the competition. As I'm watching this unfold during the episode, it essentially exposes a flaw in the show's format, which is that the show does not incentivize its cast members to treat it like a competition if sharing is allowed and if only a limited amount of survival items are provided. But my second issue with this episode, at least involving Jeff's team, was how Sarah and to some extent Gary joined Chini in treating Jeff like crap. I noticed that right before Jeff cut his finger, Gary was asking repeatedly to see Jeff's saw. And not too long after Jeff cut his finger, Gary took the saw and never gave it back. As Jeff was getting medical treatment, Sarah, Chini, and Gary left camp without telling Jeff what they were doing, and Sarah and Chini essentially used Gary in order to acquire survival items that they did not offer to share with Gary. Now, in my opinion, this was one of the most passive-aggressive cutthroat scenes that was shown during this episode. The other scene was watching how Gary, Sarah, and Chini snuck off in the middle of the night to the other team's camp to eat impala without telling Jeff about it. Only Gary had the nerve to share some impala with Jeff, but it was only a small piece of the neck. But lastly, my biggest issue with the episode will be Team Matt, Waz, Steven, and Dan. It's clear that these guys have a good chemistry, and they excel in completing the challenges together. Where this team loses my respect was how they throw stones and hide their hands when it comes to making a pact with Jeff's team not to share anything with Jeff, but when they finally had a chance to address Jeff to his face, they blame him for not wanting to share his items with the group. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I'm getting a little tired of hearing about this no-share policy. Unless I missed something, Jeff clearly was willing to trade and barter with the other survivalists. After all, what is the incentive of burning calories to acquire these survival items if survivalists like Chini and Sarah could freely use the items without putting any skin in the game? In a game where there's $100,000 on the line, it would suck for those folks who exhausted themselves physically to lose to a survivalist that sat back and allowed everyone to do the hard work. But getting back to Jeff, he simply wanted to trade valuable items for valuable items, and the response from the other survivalists was, "If you don't just give us the items you work hard to get, we won't share anything with you." Now, for a group of people who claim to want to compete against the best survivalists by the end of the challenge, it's clear that they're all being hypocrites. But with that being said, I think that Jeff will do well enough to make it to the last leg of the challenge, but the lack of food and his injuries will eventually take their toll on him. I honestly think that Gary and Dan will face off to see who's the last one standing, and I think Dan will end up victorious. But that's my opinion, and I'd like to know what you all think about the episode or my review. Please feel free to leave all comments below in the comment section, and I'll be sure to reply to everybody. Until next time, stay tuned and stay safe. Peace.